What's something you wish your family would just admit already?
My parents never bought me so much as a toy, not once, and I am not exaggerating or saying it for dramatic effect, because while other kids went to bed with stuffed animals or spent Saturday mornings on the floor with Lego sets or Barbie dolls, I would sit with whatever scraps I could find, broken crayons, old magazines, cardboard from the trash, and I would invent games on my own, and even though I tried to convince myself that it made me creative and tough, deep down I knew the truth. They simply did not care enough to give me even the smallest gesture of love in the form of something as simple as a toy. The funny part, if you can call it funny, is that whenever I asked why, the answer was always the same line, word for word, like they rehearsed it. "We don't have money for that nonsense. You'll thank us one day." That was their justification, as if deprivation would somehow turn into gratitude down the road, as if a child who learned to live without should later applaud the lesson. But the thing is, I didn't see any lack of money when my sister came along. With her, they suddenly had resources, they suddenly found ways to make birthdays magical, they suddenly were able to show up with new clothes, trips to the zoo, even a shiny pink bike that everyone in the neighborhood admired, while I was left standing there, clapping for her, pretending not to notice that nobody had ever wheeled one into the driveway for me. I started working when I was barely a teenager. Babysitting, mowing lawns, stocking shelves at a local store the minute I was legally allowed. Also, I could buy myself the things no one else ever thought to give me. Shoes, school supplies, sometimes even food when my mom would forget to pack me lunch money, but somehow never forgot when my sister had a class field trip. Teachers used to comment on how responsible I was, how mature beyond my years, and at the time, I ate up those compliments like they meant something good. But looking back now, I know what they really meant. You are carrying weight no kid should have to carry. And you're smiling while you do it, so everyone applauds the mask without realizing what it costs. Meanwhile, my sister lived like a princess in the same house, under the same roof, but in a completely different reality. They paid her way through summer camps, they took her on shopping sprees before each school year, they even got her a car the moment she turned 16. Not a junker, not a used clunker to practice driving on, but a shiny, reliable car with insurance fully covered, while I was still paying off my student loans, still figuring out how to keep the lights on in my apartment, still patching together enough money to cover bus fare, because I never had that kind of parental safety net. You'd think maybe it was because she was younger, or maybe because by then they were more financially stable, but I know better. It wasn't about money, it was about choice. They chose her. They chose to invest in her, to spoil her, to treat her as the baby of the family who deserved protection and gifts and celebration, while I was the one who was supposed to be strong, the one they bragged about because I was independent, because I never asked for anything. The irony is I did ask, I asked plenty, but they trained themselves to see my voice as noise and hers as music. I cannot tell you how many holidays I spent pretending the lack of a gift didn't sting, how many birthdays I tried to downplay so it wouldn't hurt as much when no one cared enough to mark the occasion, how many times I overheard relatives say, "Well, she's the strong one, she doesn't need all that fuss," while my sister would glow under the spotlight. And yes, I swallowed it, because what else was I going to do? Start screaming at the table that they were cruel and unfair? No, I kept my mouth shut, I smiled, I collected the plates, and I let the resentment settle in my bones where nobody could see it. I really thought that once we grew up, once we were both adults with our own lives, the favoritism would fade out. Surely when we were equals in age and responsibility, when the excuse of childhood was gone, my parents would recognize that I deserved the same respect, the same generosity, the same acknowledgement. I thought maybe one day they'd realize how much I had sacrificed, how hard I had worked without ever leaning on them, and maybe they would finally see me as someone worth investing in, not just the reliable background character to my sister's main stage role. But I was wrong, completely wrong, because if anything, it only got worse. The divide didn't close with age, it widened. What they once excused as not having money turned into blatant choices, decisions made right in front of me without shame or hesitation, and that's when the bitterness that I had tucked away for years finally started to rise, and I knew, sooner or later, something would snap. Because if childhood had taught me that I was invisible, adulthood would prove that they intended to keep me invisible forever, and I could no longer pretend not to see it. And trust me when I say, it got uglier than I ever imagined. They called it a family dinner, which in our house always meant the same routine where my mother played host like she was doing us a favor, and my father held court with that smug satisfaction that only shows up when he is about to pat himself on the back. So when they asked for attention and my mother pulled out a little velvet pouch while my father slid a thick folder across the table, I already felt the familiar pressure in my chest that comes from bracing for another performance in which I and the seasoned extra pretending to enjoy the show, and then my sister lifted the keys with this breathless laugh, and my mother said the words with a kind of triumphant relief that they had finally done something meaningful for the child who made them proud, that she deserved a place to rest and recharge after all her hard work, that it was time she had a vacation home to call her own. I smiled because I've learned that smiling buys you quiet and quiet buys you time, and I looked at the folder as if I were just being helpful while I snapped the photos they asked for. Hold the keys up, tilt your head. Let me get the stamped page in the background because it looks official, and while everyone clapped and my brother-in-law lifted a glass to the best parents in the world, I watched the details the way I always do when I am the only one in the room not drunk on the fantasy. Noticing the county seal, the trust name that was a little too familiar, the bank logo I had not seen in years, and the way my father cleared his throat right before he said the phrase about blessings and sacrifice that he always uses when he believes he has done something noble. You would think I would cry, or storm out, or cause a scene, but that is not my style and it never has been, because scenes let people call you dramatic and wash their hands of what they did, while measured choices make them sit with themselves. So when my mother tried to pass me the keys for a closer look and said in that sweet tone that we should all be happy for the baby, I held them for a beat longer than necessary, felt their weight, turned them in my hand like I was admiring the engraving, slid my phone under the edge of the folder for one clear shot of the signature page, and handed everything back with a thank you that sounded polite enough to pass as support even as something in me settled into this cool, steady certainty that I was done being the good daughter who laughed along. The conversation moved to paint colors and short-term rentals and whether the deck would hold a hot tub, and my sister asked if I could help with a weekend of babysitting while they did a furniture run. Because of course the assumption was that I would fall into line the way I always had, juggling my own life so theirs could run smoothly, but instead of giving my usual practical answer and trying to make it work, I stood up, lifted my glass, and gave a toast that was not a toast at all, telling them I was genuinely glad my sister had something she loved and that I hoped it brought her peace, and then I said, with the same even tone I use at work when I am announcing a new policy, that effective immediately I would no longer be available for unpaid favors, last-minute rescues, or quiet cleanups of messes I did not make, that I was resigning from the role of dependable background problem solver that I had been drafted into as a teenager and never compensated for as an adult, and that any future requests for my time would be treated the way any professional treats time, scheduled in advance and respected or not scheduled at all. The table went awkwardly still because everyone knows what I have done for years even if no one ever says it out loud, and my mother tried that little laugh she uses when she wants to erase a moment by pretending it was a joke, while my father pushed his chair back as if the air had gotten too warm, and my sister rushed to say I was overthinking things and that family should not keep score, which is what people always say when the score is lopsided in their favor, so I smiled again, reached into my bag, and placed an envelope between the centerpiece and the folder with the deed, explaining that since we were celebrating adult gifts and real property and grown-up responsibilities, I had brought a small bit of housekeeping of my own. A clear itemization of the utilities I had covered during the winters when their money management accidentally left the heat bill unpaid, the grocery runs I had quietly funded when the fridge was mysteriously empty right before holidays, the rides and workday hours and emergency pickups that disappeared into the black hole of family memory, not because I expected payment that night, but because I was declaring that the account was closed and would not be reopened. My sister sputtered about how crass it was to bring money into a celebration, and my mother muttered something about gratitude, and my father told me not to make this about me, and for once I felt the calm that comes from telling the truth without flinching. Because I was not making it about me, they had done that for years, and I was simply correcting the ledger, and when my sister's husband reached for the envelope like he might tear it in half, I slid it closer to my father and said that if anyone in the room believed in fairness as much as they claimed, then a simple record should not offend them, especially when all it really said was that I would not be available to subsidize their choices anymore. I left soon after, not with a dramatic exit or a door slam, just a polite thank you and a hug that did not linger, and when I got home I set my phone on the counter and opened the photo I had taken of the signature page. And as I zoomed in on the trust name that had nagged at me all evening, I felt that same steady certainty shift into something sharper, because it was not just familiar, it was mine. The label from an old custodial account that was supposed to have been held for my education and never spoken of again, and as the realization clicked into place that the house keys they had gifted were dangling from a chain tied to something that once belonged to me, I knew the envelope on the table had been the polite appetizer, and that the real meal, the one they would remember, was only just being served. When I zoomed in on the signature line and saw the trust label spelled out in the tidy bank font that used to sit next to my name on annual statements I never received, but always knew existed, because my father once slipped and called it my education cushion, the pieces rearranged themselves in a way I could not unsee, since that phrase, custodial under the Uniform Transfers Act for the benefit of me, was not just family lore or a nice idea that disappeared into adulthood the moment I turned legal. It was a legitimate fiduciary obligation with rules attached, rules my parents evidently treated like polite suggestions rather than duties. And once I understood that the down payment for the house keys dangling from my sister's manicured fingers had come from an account that was meant to pay my tuition and launch my life, I realized this was not about fairness anymore. This was about a provable breach that left footprints on public records and bank ledgers and tax forms, and suddenly the calm I felt at dinner turned into focus, clean and sharp, like the moment before a race when every muscle knows the route. The next morning I made coffee, opened my laptop, and did the thing I have always done better than anyone in my family, which is to follow paper until it tells the truth. Starting with the county recorder's site where the deed lived along with the vesting language and the date stamps and the title company's file number. Then moving to the property tax roll where the mailing address confirmed the trust's contact matched my parents' house rather than my sister's place, then calling the title office and asking, in the reasonable tone of a beneficiary who simply wants to confirm chain of funds, whether the closing file contained a gift letter or a cashier's check, and if so, from which institution, and while they did not hand me copies, they confirmed just enough that my next call, to the bank where my childhood savings were supposedly parked until they were not, sounded less like a fishing expedition and more like a compliance conversation in which a customer has the right to request custodial account history, especially when the named minor is now an adult and the custodian appears to have disposed of assets for the benefit of someone else. Because I am not naive about institutions, I did not expect a front desk clerk to hand me everything on the spot, so I paired that call with a text to Lauren, who is not just a friend, but a certified public accountant who does forensic work for people who find themselves on the wrong side of messy divorces and small business implosions. And when I told her what I believed happened and sent the photo with the trust name and the county file number, she called me back so fast it felt like she had been sitting on the phone, and in that low no-nonsense voice she uses when something is both serious and solvable, she told me to gather 3 things: proof the custodial account existed in my name, proof of the transfer from that account to the trust, and proof that the funds were used for a purpose that was not for my direct benefit, because once those 3 dots were connected the map would be clear enough to present to a bank's internal investigations team, a state attorney general's consumer division, or, if my parents wanted to get brave, a civil court that would happily freeze a property with a pendency notice while we sorted out what belonged to whom. I reached out to Andre, who used to sit 2 cubicles down from me before he left to work at a title company where his whole job is to keep deals from collapsing under the weight of secrets. And I asked him hypothetical questions that were not hypothetical at all, like whether a beneficiary could cloud title if funds misappropriated from her were used as consideration, and how quickly a lease pendens could be recorded after a complaint is filed, and whether the mere existence of that document would halt a cash-out refinance or block a rental management company from signing contracts. And he laughed the grim laugh of a man who has watched enough happy sellers become panicked sellers, and he told me that title is allergic to uncertainty, that the threat of an unresolved claim scares lenders more than any speech I could give at a dinner table, and that if I wanted leverage without theatrics, a well-written complaint paired with a demand letter and a packet of exhibits was the cleanest lever in the drawer. So I built the packet the way I build everything that matters, slowly and thoroughly, starting with a request to the bank's custodial accounts department citing the uniform transfer statute that governed the account, then adding the property file references and the public records printouts with the little index numbers circled, then pulling old emails where my father bragged to relatives that he had made sure I would not have to worry about tuition, which was almost funny in the way a bruise is funny because the joke is on the person who thought it would fade, and finally drafting a 2-page narrative for Lauren that laid out the timeline from childhood to dinner, including the photograph of the deed signature page that I rotated and sharpened until the trust label read like a confession. Lauren, being Lauren, did not stop at encouragement. She marked up my narrative with notes about tax implications, telling me that if custodial funds were liquidated there should have been filings in my name that I never signed, and that the absence of those filings was itself suspicious, and that if my parents had tried to play games with basis or gifts or transfers to avoid reporting, the bank and the revenue department would care a great deal, which meant that my leverage was not just emotional but practical and immediate, since the last thing any adult wants, especially one who just posed with keys for a family photo, is a letter from a government office asking questions that require receipts. While those requests and letters moved into the world, I did something smaller, but in its way more radical for me, which was to tell my sister no when she sent a cheerful message about paint swatches and asked if I could swing by on Saturday to help with the kids while she met a contractor, and instead of cushioning the refusal with apologies or explanations, I wrote that I had plans, which was true, because my plan involved a notary, a filing window, a print shop that does certified mail with return receipts, and a quiet office where I could sign a verification page without my hand shaking. And when she sent back a string of fake hurt lines about how family should support family, I put my phone face down and held on to the steadiness that comes from acting in daylight after years of swallowing darkness. By the end of the week, I had a neat stack on my kitchen table, one envelope addressed to the bank's compliance unit, one to the state's Consumer Protection Bureau, one to the title company's general counsel, and a thicker one with my name on it containing the stamped copy of a complaint that Andre's colleague had looked over as a professional courtesy with a few surgical edits that made the remedies crystal clear. And as I slid each envelope into my bag and set an alarm to arrive at the recorder's office when the doors opened, I thought about keys and who truly holds them, and I recognized that while my parents had given my sister something shiny to wave around, I was holding something heavier and far less decorative, a mechanism that could lock and unlock things they cared about, and the best part was that I did not need anyone's permission to turn it. I slept well for the first time in a long time, not from gloating, but from relief that I was finally done arguing with ghosts, and when my alarm went off and I dressed in the kind of unremarkable clothes I wear to do serious errands, I felt the kind of quiet that happens right before a storm that you chose and prepared for, and as I walked out the door with my packet and my list and my calm, a thought landed with the finality of a gavel, which was that by the time my sister finished her morning coffee and drove over to admire her new deck, there would be a case number attached to her deed and a question mark attached to her future, and none of them, not my father with his speeches nor my mother with her soft excuses, had the faintest idea what was already in motion. The recorder's office opened with the same sleepy indifference it shows every weekday morning, and I walked in carrying my packet and my quiet resolve, knowing that I did not need anyone to validate what was true because paper has a way of speaking for itself when it is filed in the right place. So I took a number, waited without fidgeting, and when the clerk called me forward, I slid across the stamped complaint, the verification, and the notice of pendency that would attach itself to the parcel like a sober shadow, and I watched the clerk check the legal description and the trust style and the grantor line, and when she stamped the top sheet and passed me back a copy with the fresh ink of the instrument number, I felt something inside me unlock in a way that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with finally using the correct lever. From there I walked around the corner to the title company listed on the deed because while certified mail would have done the job, hand delivery closes loops in a way that cannot be misunderstood. And I asked for the general counsel's office and left a slender folder with the demand letter that Lauren had polished until it gleamed, a timeline that was clear without being emotional, and exhibits labeled so calmly that even a stranger could follow them. And when the receptionist asked whether I needed a receipt, I said a copy with a date stamp would be fine, and then I stepped back onto the sidewalk where the day looked ordinary, while my family's new prize quietly acquired a reputation that no lender or insurer enjoys. On my way home, I stopped at the print shop that handles my office errands and sent off the compliance packet to the bank through overnight service with return receipt requested. Then did the same with the State Consumer Bureau because I wanted them both to arrive almost together, like synchronized swimmers hitting the water at the same time, and I sent the title company's copy by email as well, addressed to the attorney whose name appears on every closing sheet in that office, copying a generic compliance inbox, not because I doubted the first recipient, but because redundancy is not hostility. It is how you keep people honest when they would prefer not to be. By the time I got back to my apartment and poured a glass of tap water, my phone was already showing the first ripple. A voicemail from a friendly coordinator at a short-term rental management firm who said she had been retained to list a charming coastal retreat and was reaching out to verify there were no title impediments because her legal team had spotted a pending claim. And while she was sure it was nothing, she had to confirm because their platform freezes onboarding at the first sign of trouble, and I smiled at the ceiling because this is how leverage behaves when you treat it like engineering rather than theater. It moves to the weak points while you are still washing your hands. In the afternoon, my sister called, then called again, then switched to texts that hopped between sugar and spite, asking if I had done something strange because the rental company had paused the listing and the contractor suddenly wanted proof of funds before placing orders for appliances. And the insurance broker had left a chirpy message about an underwriting question related to beneficial interests, and their lender, who had previously been all smiles about a cash-out refinance once a few upgrades were complete, now wanted a written explanation about an adverse recording, and I typed back a single sentence that said I would be available to meet at a neutral location with both parents present and with her husband if he wished, and that I preferred to handle family business in person rather than volleying half information by text, which she read as arrogance. But it was discipline, and discipline is a language my family never learned because consequences were always outsourced to someone like me. We met in a glass-walled conference room at the library because I was not stepping into their house to be ambushed by a performance, and I laid out the packet the way a teacher lays out a lesson plan, not to humiliate but to make the path unavoidable. The custodial account statements that Lauren coaxed out of the bank's archives, the absence of any legitimate transfer to my benefit, the wire to the trust within weeks of the down payment, the closing statement reflecting those funds, and the fresh recording numbers that now lived in the county's index like little anchors. And when my father tried to launch into a speech about family sacrifice and how money is just a tool and how I of all people should not be petty, I held up a hand and told him that words had carried this family long enough and that, from this point forward, the only language we were speaking would be documents and signatures. I gave them the offer the way Lauren told me to give it, not as a plea and not as a threat, but as a clean exit ramp that any rational adult would take if they cared about their future more than their pride, which was that the trust would either return to me the full amount siphoned from the custodial account plus a modest calculation for lost opportunity, or, if cash was not available because they had already chased their dream, the property would be listed for sale within a set number of Weeks with the proceeds first satisfying my restitution before a single dollar touched anyone else's pocket, and in exchange I would dismiss the complaint with prejudice and send letters withdrawing my notices so that the title could breathe again. My mother cried because tears had always been her quickest solvent for uncomfortable moments, and my sister called me heartless and ungrateful and every other label that bullies like to throw when the mirror shows them something they do not like, and my father, who has always thought of himself as a fixer, leaned forward with that bargaining face he uses with car dealers and said that maybe we were all overreacting because they had intended to help me later, and it was only timing, and surely I could see that, and that was the moment I realized none of them believed consequences were real until they showed up wearing a badge that other adults respect. So I took out my phone, put it on the table, and clicked the little speaker icon as Lauren joined the call with a bank investigator who introduced himself politely and explained that preliminary review suggested a misuse of custodial assets and that, while he could not discuss details with parties other than the beneficiary, it would be wise for the custodians to consult counsel because the bank had an obligation to report certain patterns to regulators. Silence is a strange creature in my family because it rarely visits, yet it sat in that conference room like a heavy third party while I closed my folder and told them I would expect their decision in writing by the end of the week. And when my sister asked what would happen if they refused, I said nothing dramatic and nothing cruel, only that the process would continue without my participation, and that by the time summer arrived the house they had posed with would be wearing an asterisk fig. Enough to scare away any buyer with sense, and as I stood to leave my phone buzzed with a message that I did not open until I reached the parking lot. A short line from a name I had not seen in months, my mother's older sister who keeps the family's real secrets, asking whether I was free to talk because there was something about that trust one needed to know before I took the next step, and I realized that for all the leverage I had created, the final move in this game might not be written in the county records at all. My aunt did not waste time on pleasantries or nostalgia because she is the only person in this family who treats truth like a task that needs finishing. So when we met, she slid a thick envelope across the table and told me she had held onto it for years because she suspected it would matter one day. And inside I found the original custodial agreement with my name spelled out in full and her name listed as the successor custodian for the simple reason that my grandmother did not trust my father with anything that required restraint, and clipped to the back was a copy of a transfer request bearing a signature that was supposed to be hers yet looked like a cheap imitation done in a hurry, along with a notary stamp from a man whose commission had expired before the date on the form, which meant the paper trail I had already built was not only persuasive, but now punctured by the kind of defect that turns an awkward family dispute into a case file that nobody with a license wants to explain to a regulator. Lauren read the packet with the same focused expression she wears when she knows we are past debating feelings and well into the territory of consequences, and she asked my aunt to sign a short affidavit verifying that she never authorized the liquidation, that she never received a dime, and that the custodial funds were diverted without the beneficiary's knowledge, after which Lauren added a clean addendum to the complaint and sent a courtesy copy to the bank investigator who had already left a careful voicemail about escalation procedures. And within a day, I received a call from a number I did not know that turned out to be my parents' newly retained attorney, whose voice had the wary politeness of a man who has seen enough to know when the ground is crumbling under his client's feet. And he asked if we might discuss a resolution that would avoid further filings, public hearings, and the type of notices that live forever in digital court indexes. I said we could meet provided it was on neutral ground and everything was reduced to writing by the end of the conversation, and when we sat down in a businesslike conference room that did not care about anyone's embarrassment, I laid out the terms without heat and without apology, explaining that the house would be listed within a short, specified window, that the proceeds would first satisfy full restitution to me for every misdirected dollar plus a reasonable measure of lost opportunity, calculated by Lauren, that my legal fees would be covered so I did not subsidize the cleanup, and that the apology I was owed would not be performed in a living room with crocodile tears and casseroles, but written plainly, signed by both parents, and kept by me as the only souvenir I intended to keep from this season of my life, and that once those conditions were met I would dismiss with prejudice and withdraw my recording so the title could breathe again. My father tried one last time to play the good man who made imperfect choices under pressure, and my mother reached for the oldest trick she knows by suggesting that maybe we could fix this without dragging everyone through a sale that would upset my sister's children. And my sister alternated between insult and pleading like a person shuffling cards she does not know how to play. But the attorney, who understood the math, the paper, and the tone of the bank investigator's messages, finally told them in careful language that the road ahead was not a debate about family dynamics, it was a matter of exposure and mitigation, and that the offer I had put on the table was the kind of exit a sane person takes when the alternative involves years of litigation and a complaint that might attract more attention than they could tolerate. They signed the agreement on the spot because the idea of a listing was suddenly less frightening than the idea of a public fight they could not choreograph. And the house hit the market fast with the kind of careful wording that pretends nothing unusual is happening. And after the closing I received a check addressed to me alone that cleared without drama, because title services love nothing more than tidy math approved by everyone with standing, and I walked it into my credit union and did not cry or whisper a speech about justice. I just deposited what was mine and drove to a small office where a straightforward agent handed me another packet that represented a place of my own purchased in my name, only with no theatrics, no family strings, and no one else's idea of what I should be grateful for. A dull little deed that might look boring to anyone expecting grand gestures yet felt like oxygen after years of breathing through a straw. The apology letter arrived by certified mail a week later, and I opened it at my kitchen counter without ceremony, and while it was full of careful phrases that smelled like a lawyer's edits and not much like remorse, it carried the one sentence I needed. A plain admission that they had used funds held for my benefit for the purchase of my sister's property, and that they recognized the harm and returned the amount owed, and I slipped it into a folder with my copies of the settlement and the old custodial agreement and the affidavit my aunt signed, not because I wanted to revisit them like keepsakes, but because the act of filing them under my control closed a door that had stood open my entire life. My sister called and left a long message that swung between calling me a thief and calling me a savior of family order because I had prevented worse fallout, and I did not call back because there was nothing to say that would change how she reads fairness. And a week after that my aunt sent me a page in my grandmother's handwriting that I had never seen, a simple note that said she had set aside that money so I would never feel small in a world that rewards the loud, and that if anyone ever tried to turn my independence into an excuse to take from me, I should use my voice in grown-up ways until doors opened. And I stood there with that note in my hand and thought about all the years I wasted trying to be understood by people who preferred me silent. I did not host a victory dinner or deliver a speech on forgiveness, because neither of those things fits the shape of what happened. And I do not pretend that the aftermath is neat since holidays are now awkward and group texts sit unanswered, and a part of me still grieves the version of family I begged for as a kid. Yet every time I lock the door to the place I bought with funds that were mine from the start, I feel the lightest kind of satisfaction, not rage and not triumph for the sake of hurting anyone. Just the solid feeling that comes when you stop renting space in your own life from people who never meant to hand you a key, and if they tell themselves a story in which I was cruel or calculating, I can live with that. Because the truth is simple enough to fit in a single breath. They handed my sister a house and expected me to clap from the background, and I handed them what they deserved. Not a scene or a scandal, but consequences carried all the way to the end.